Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. In late 2025, Kazakhstan's president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev proposed a series of constitutional amendments. But within weeks, the process evolved into a hasty, comprehensive constitutional rewrite. In mid-February, the Constitutional Commission published a draft abolishing the Senate, introducing a vice presidency, strengthening presidential legislative powers, and elevating domestic law above international treaties. A referendum was scheduled just 1 month later, for March 15th. The government presents the reform as a means to enhance stability, efficiency, and state credibility in an increasingly volatile world. But critics argue that the speed of the process, coupled with police intimidation of the reform's critics, signals a consolidation of presidential power and tighter control over political succession in an already authoritarian state, at the expense of rights and freedoms. This week, we're talking about Kazakhstan's new constitution and what it means for the country's future. Joining us is Dmitriy Mazorenko, a journalist and co-founder of the Superstructure Research Center. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Dima. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so maybe let's start from understanding the very, very basic things. Why does Kazakhstan need a new constitution? And what is behind the idea to introduce it in the first place?
So it was a real surprise to announce the constitution, because nobody expected that it would go that way. Actually, we are in the middle of Tokayev's term. It is formally first one, but informally it is the second. And we are approaching the next period of transition of power, which will be conducted in 2029. But actually, Kazakhstan never conducted elections in their regular dates. So it is quite understandable why the political regime is in the rush. So I believe that some things are behind our horizon of events, and maybe there is a room for inter-elites clash that is exacerbating after January events. And I'm not only talking about the clash between so-called old Kazakhstan and new one, because the watershed here is very invisible. There is a hybrid system of elites right now, and their positions can be changed or affected by the actors themselves. So there is a plenty room for political rivalry and contestations. But actually, it seems that this contestation cannot be appeared from the bottom level.
Okay, but on the very basic level, why does Tokayev want to introduce this new constitution? Is there any kind of official reason why Kazakhstan needs a new legal basis for everything?
It is a striking thing, actually, because the whole reform, which is not reform anymore, but something like transformation, started from the parliament's changes. It was supposed just to merge two chambers of parliament into one and keeping almost the same amount of chairs inside it, maybe just slightly change the complexity of legislature processes. But for some reason, they needed to expand it, to put a pause on the previous political order, to reset it for another one. And the logic may be in the very economical field, because what we are witnessing right now is the deterioration of economic conditions right after the January events happened in 2022.
Maybe let's remind our listeners what are the January events, because this is the second time you're referring to them.
Yes.
So the January events are the events that happened in January 2022 when inflated prices for gas sparked protests across the country that turned bloody, in which, well, how many people lost their lives? Do we know?
More than 100, but it is a preliminary estimations, and we do not know exact figures, unfortunately.
So these clashes actually served also as, smoke for something bigger happening behind the scenes, a rivalry between the new and the old elite. Would you like to say anything more about that to maybe explain to our listeners what we're referring to?
Yeah, so January events was conflict between two parts of elite, Nazarbayev's wing and Tokayev's new administration, which was just appearing that days. The problem was in the power collision, because these two figures were acting simultaneously and had a lot of conflict in their decisions. For instance, for making various appointments to Tokayev, it was quite difficult for Tokayev to make various appointments because he had to receive consent from the Nazarbayev side. And his area of action was very limited by this sort of more powerful figure, because Nazarbayev headed the National Security Council back then, and it allowed him to control most of appointments, especially in the law enforcement system and military side of the things. So the problem for them was a division of power, and our constitution and other documents, legal documents, were not reconcile these two sides of conflict. That is why it sparked conflict between them, because, there were a lot of processes behind. There was also a moment of redistribution of various assets, which are seen in a more explicit way right now. But then they discussed the preliminary steps of this redistribution, and it underpins the whole problem of January protests. But what has happened beyond the inter-elite clash was mass protests, which were, I believe, to most extent spontaneous, because they were disorganized. There were no political organizations or leaders under them. And this disorganization deadlocked the whole protest movement, because there were no sides who can express grievances of the people and to create a political process out of them. And the whole political crisis was handled by Tokayev himself, who asked Vladimir Putin through CSTO to deploy peaceful troops and stop the very crisis. And the whole protest was more than just a political crisis, because it reminded both sides of political regime that they lack political legitimacy, because protesters demanded to dismantle current regime with its oligarchic order, to redistribute wealth and make living conditions of the people more robust than they were at this exact moment of pandemic and rapidly growing inflation.
Okay, so let's go back to the new constitution and what's behind the idea. So what are the changes that the constitution will introduce? What are the main ideas that the new constitution will implement?
There are a lot of conjunctural changes. Let me put it directly. The constitution is not a legal document. It's a political document. It traces the various periods of society creation, which to most extent were bloody. Let's remember great French Revolution of 18th century and forthcoming events. And here in Kazakhstan, we did not have such a story of political clash that underpin the constitution. Of course, there were two state orders and the transition between them, but they were not following with mass protests or rivalries. There were conflicts between elites, but at the same time, there was not a grassroots movement which demanded to be involved in the process of constitutional design. What now we see, the ideologization of the constitution, we can see various marks that are conjuncturally created as a polit-technological platform for Tokayev, like Just Full Kazakhstan, which is the empty signifier because there is no clear understanding what does it mean. Are we creating a new industrial basis for the country and trying to, overturn the process of deindustrialization that Kazakhstan faced 35 years ago? Or we are going to reinvigorate the exploitation of natural resources, their extraction and export? It isn't clear, and that is the problem of the very legitimacy crisis here in Kazakhstan, because what Tokayev promised when he started his presidency was the breakthrough in economic realm. He offered rapid increase in GDP, rapid increase in investments, but it seems that we are very limited in our opportunities to overcome various economic problems. And there is no structural thinking beyond that process. And strictly speaking, there is no interest from the elite side to re-establish economic system for the interest of the many, but not the few. And this constitution is an answer for unfulfilled promises that Tokayev gave. And it's very aimed to stop the grassroots activities and make a president even more ultimate figure in this political domain that we have than it was. And this thing really fascinates me because we are already a super presidential country. And for me, as a citizen and observer, it was sort of a miracle how you can become more powerful in super presidential country than you are right now. But there are a lot of room for that. And we see this through the creation of the figure of vice president. It means that we...
So the constitution introduces the figure of vice president, which doesn't exist
yes.
at the moment. Okay. So what does this function entail?
Yeah. It existed in the first years of independence, but then it was phased out to create the institution of Senate. And technically, the figure of Senate Speaker was the second highest authority in the country, meaning that the whole parliament was a key player in the political process. It was dedicated to back presidents if he would find himself not able to govern. And now this authority was dissolved, and the president will appoint vice president and give the full role of his or her responsibilities. And vice president will back president in the cases of emergency or any other circumstances.
And so in practice, why does it matter? So why this is such a difference from what we have now, which is the speaker of the parliament is the second most important person in the country? What difference does it make?
The whole difference is in the very nature of parliament. Parliament is a representative institution which supposed to be headed by citizens. Let me sharpen it. One-party system, because there is a ruling party as a monad and several other parties that are sort of flanks of the ruling institution. And their only function is to create additional places for elite to co-opt them into the system rather than give them an opportunity to battle for minds and hearts of the people. So there is no political process inside that. And what is interesting here is that after January events, presidential administration introduced the hybrid system of parliament member elections, which combines party lists and single-member constituencies. Single-member constituencies back then were filtrated, so not any independent figure from the civil society could really get the power. What happened there? The political regime created their own single-mandate parliament members, and after years, they found out that these people are not fully under their control. And that was a big problem for them. They become scared of this spontaneity and decided to roll this decision back.
Another change that the new constitution will introduce is creating one Kurultai instead of the two chambers parliament that we have now, so Majlis and the Senate. What is the reason for this change? And is it going to create even less democracy?
As far as I mentioned, there is no democracy in the parliament, unfortunately. But this merge of two chambers is like the optimization of legislature process. It means that authorities will spend less time on the creation and discussion of every law and legal document, because previously it was necessary to go through two stages, the Majlis stage and then Senate, and they were detached from each other to some extent, meaning that they discussed the precise law in their circle and then maybe pull it back to Majlis to revise the document and then examine it one more time. In the near future, we will have one solid process without two stages, and it will speed up a lot of things for president. And of course, there is no any sharp debate about any document for the sake of people interest. There are a lot of lobbyist groups that are seeking their benefits inside it. But now, through this division of power, we can have much more nuanced examination of every document, and various stakeholders can play on the contradictions between them for having more pleasant legislator framework.
So the first thing that the new constitution will introduce is the position of the vice president, then one chamber parliament. And is there anything else that maybe struck you or surprised you in the draft?
Yes. So Parliament lost a lot of its authority to give a consent about president's appointment. Previously, Parliament members agreed on candidates for the top positions of Central Bank, of General Prosecutor's Office, and Human Rights Commissioner. And now it will just approve several figures like Prime Minister, members of Central Electoral Commission, and Supreme Audit Chamber. So we see that it will lose the control under executive wing of power.
So it will be the president who will be appointing those people now, or?
Yes, by himself, without any consult to parliament.
So what are the consequences of these changes? And what sort of country emerges from the pages of the new draft? Can we compare it to any other systems that already exist in the world, or is it something completely new?
No, it's obviously not that new. To some extent, it repeats various steps of Russian constitution that was approved on the referendum in 2020, especially this step with creation of quasi-representative entity as a national council. There will be 126 members, which will be appointed by president in smoke-filled room. But there are lots of unique things that will be said because of local political conjuncture. And that is why it is hard to compare such things. There is one key process that can be reintroduced from historical points of view. What really catched my attention is this weakening of parliament. It looks like they treat it like rudimentary institution, and to some extent it resonates with what happens in Italy in the beginning of 20th century, because there was also a crisis of liberal system, and the parliament was a deeply rooted part of this problem, because rivalry between parliament members did not give a lot of room for bottom political activity, and people contested the very right to vote, to be a participant of political realm. And this weakening of parliament can lead us to the bigger problem, deeper crisis of liberal institutions. And peripheral countries like Kazakhstan always are in avant-garde of such disastrous processes. And we will understand the scale of this crisis very soon, I believe. So we have the neighbor, Russia, who made such decisions earlier, and we are witnessing that it ended up with war and with re-establishment of Putinism as a radical reactionary type of regime, which logic we do not clearly understand as of now. Of course, Kazakhstan is a much smaller country. It cannot pretend to be a sub-imperial actor as Russia to wage wars and make outer expansion. But maybe this spirit of the war will be localized internally, and the political regime will crack on opposition, on civil society members, limiting their very narrow opportunities to affect political environment.
This is what I wanted to ask you next. So, does the new constitution directly affect something that for us journalists is so important? So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, human rights. Does the constitution directly address those issues? Or when it comes to the document itself, it doesn't really talk about that?
The problem is that the very lack of freedom of expression and freedom of speech is predetermined in many other legal documents. So the new constitution cannot puzzle us in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, because they are very limited by other legal documents. And also, being an authoritarian country, we as journalists or civil activists are under permanent threat of prosecution, being it legal or illegal. We are very limited in the very space of our expression, because there is a huge censorship across the various media, which to most extent are controlled by the state or groups of interest related to the state. And yes, of course, it is awful that we are seeing the limitation, but our risky position is much more wider than can be expressed by the Constitution.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. Some media outlets and some people have criticized the new constitution and faced consequences. One man, Kantemir Almyshev, was sentenced for 15 days of administrative arrest. And I wonder, why do the authorities do that? Why do they try to stifle any sort of discussion about the new constitution?
Answering your very first question, I mentioned the constitutional crisis. When we are in such a position, we see the mobilization of the people. So the first constitution was very new to them, right? There was dissolving of one order and the creation of another political order.
We're talking about the fall of the USSR at the beginning of the 90s.
Yes. And now we are in a position of more robust economy, more robust political realm than it was earlier. And this change of constitution can be perceived by the people. So they have time to understand it, to analyze and to react. And they see that there is something hidden inside it, because this move to ballooning presidential authority is what people contested a while ago. And there is a reproducing process of such that they are not ready to face with. So we have two impulses here, right? The first one is the constitutional crisis that pose various questions and grassroots activities. And the second one is people's interest to reinvigorating of presidential authority. And it will motivate to raise awareness among grassroots, and political regime will be counter-mobilized to answer this social anxiety. And as far as authoritarian regimes are naturally afraid of any grassroots mobilization, they will react in a very harsh and stark way. So the extremum here was during January events when more than 100 people were shooted. And it shows us that political regime can be very desperate in its means to control the society.
In the past, Tokayev said that before a new constitution is introduced, he will give society and experts and journalists time to discuss its provisions. So, in fact, he didn't do that. He gave us only, a month to discuss the provisions of the new constitution before the referendum takes place on the 15th of March. Why do you think this is? Why is it introduced so hastily?
That is the real question. And I believe that the very possibility to grasp the process is very limited here. It might be the case that we are facing with a rising competition between several sides of Tokayev's elite that pushed him to over-control the bureaucratical system and mitigate conflicts between them. At the same time, there are a lot of external political events related to Russia and not only that determine Tokayev's steps. It might be the case that he's really worried about sovereignty of Kazakhstan and possible war risks with Russia. Yes, we do not exactly know, but we see that the war logic expressed by Russia is still here, and its economy were reshaped to reproduce the war. And there is no any understandable direction of how Russian economy can be transformed in a very near term. So
back to peaceful conditions.
Absolutely. And it will motivate to produce the war in other areas. And Kazakhstan, of course, despite the country is under severe control of Russian political regime, because they use Kazakhstan as a spot for various parallel import activities. Also, Russian business located here. So this is the core of Putin's current ideology. He believes that he is surrounded by various enemies who are going to overturn his regime. And that is why he is trying to prevent this coup, having taken its own society under strict control and taking various political regimes, especially across post-Soviet countries, into its hands.
In the past couple of months, we've seen that Kazakhstan, but also other countries in Central Asia, have been cozying up to Trump and to the United States. And there are lots of different gossips circulating that the fact that Tokayev wants to push through the new constitution as soon as possible is because he's eyeing to become the next Secretary General of the United Nations. This gossip has been circulating widely, but what do you make of these kind of gossips? Is there any truth in them, or do you think it's just a way in which we're trying to explain the world having no data, basically, in authoritarian countries like Kazakhstan?
It seems counterintuitive for two reasons. The first one is the constitutional change. Fundamentally, it allows presidents to reset his terms. And as of now, we do not understand if Tokayev will choose this option. Technically, he is allowed to have his first presidential term because of the new constitution. And my understanding is that the whole crisis of legitimacy, economic crisis, and political crisis, this polycrisis, does not give him enough room to left his chair. It also seems that he is following this Trump's reactionary line to dismantle various international organizations like UN and push them into the deeper crisis than they are now through voting for such quasi institutions like Board of Peace.
Which Kazakhstan, by the way, is part of.
Yes, absolutely. And it was a sincere desire of Tokayev to be a part of it. We do not exactly know if he paid $1 billion donation to be in the board of this board. But there is a room for speculation because political regime can use its own shadow money to go there, right? And only time will show if it is. So wrapping up, there are several things that we can juxtapose to this possible retirement through the General Secretary position in the UN. The first one is the reset of the constitution that gives him a chance to be re-elected. And the second one is the following line of dismantling current international organization and the very rule-based order following Trump's aspirations.
So the constitutional referendum, as we said already, is being planned for March 15th. Are you planning to attend it? Are you planning to vote?
Yes, of course. I believe that it's our basic duty to do that, even if there will be no room for showing our discontent. The whole event can be the spot for bottom mobilization. And we, as a civil society, have to use any opportunity for being a part of political process, because our constitution, previous one and the future one, gives us very narrow domain to politically express us. So we can only vote at referendums and free elections that are not free in Kazakhstan, like at all. And it is the legal chance for us to let not only the regime know that we are not agreed with such a move. Political regime knows about that, and they will artificially decrease the level of those who avoid voting or voting against the constitutional change. But it should be done for the sake of the people themselves. It is the great opportunity for us to each other to understand that we are not marginal, being discontent with this transformation. And it is the opportunity for us to meet each other for various partnerships and large-scale mobilization in the future. So this electoral race should not be ignored. That is my understanding.
Finally, there are loads of changes, obviously, taking place in the world in the recent years. And I wonder if you feel any changes coming in Central Asia and in particular in Kazakhstan, because this new constitution might mark something completely new for the country, right? We don't even know what it will mean for us, but it can have far-reaching consequences. Is there anything that you are predicting? Any changes that you can see coming?
Unfortunately, we are at the moment of total unpredictability. And we can only speculate about the forthcoming future. So we are witnessing a crisis of American hegemony and this order of Americanization and rule-based system. And maybe we, as I mentioned previously, in the avant-garde of this process, dismantling institutional framework of liberal democracy, or what some scholars call democratic capitalism. There were a lot of speculations about voting rights among Kazakhstani citizens, and there is a part of elite who want to dismantle it, who want to keep society under control, and that is why this National Council institution is established. It is a quasi-representative thing that will be, to most extent, formed by presidents, and there will be no room for independent organizations and civil society members. And this is the move of overturning the political process. And in the 20th century, we saw the battle for voting rights, for representation, for more just economy. And now these aspirations may be phased out. We do not know. There are a lot of questions, but I hope that we as a society can mitigate the decay and find more progressive alternatives to this crumbling world order.
I wanted to ask you one more thing, because when we were talking about why you think this change is happening, why it's introduced so hastily, you said that maybe it has to do with Russia, but are there any other reasons why the haste might be explained?
We can speculate about health condition of Tokayev, and it also can be the third thing that his appointment to UN not an option, but we don't see clear evidence of that. There is a never-ending legend about health condition of every Central Asian political leaders. There are lots of rumors about that. And of course, we see some very confusing things that For instance, Kazakhstani government's plenaries became more closed. Journalists cannot participate directly, and they have to sit in the special rooms recording the whole process from the monitors. But again, it is the matter of speculations. We do not know it for sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dima. It was amazing to host you, and all the best to you.
Thank you for having me again.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.